Hello and welcome to another Iceberg video. Now, I was debating where to go next now that my best and worst lists are separate, and I'm really glad I asked you all. Because I initially planned to release my best of Monstercat next, but, well, I think the people have spoken. We are going to talk about the worst of NCS in 2025. I am going to take the gloves off for this one. It's not that they had a step down, it's how much of a step down they had. 2025 was where NCS felt like a completely different label in all of the worst ways possible. Remember the Brazilian funk push that I thought was going to go away? Well, it absolutely plagued the label this year. But it didn't even stop there. There was also an influx of digicore, trap rap, hyperpop, witch house, whatever that is, and so many, dare I say it, disposable songs that I could just never envision being on any other semi-competent or semi-credible EDM label. It was a case of the worst of the year not only being unlistenable, but also unnecessary. Now, I don't think this label in recent years has ever really done well in pushing or advertising their mainstays. It's part of the reason why the leadership of the artistry has often felt more vague than the likes of Monstercat. But a lot of the new arrivals this year didn't even seem chosen based on talent as much as trying to push a formula. And even with the mainstays, a lot of them conveniently chose to take this year off in more ways than one. If they weren't following modern trends, they were often calling back trends from years past out of pure desperation. You could argue it's a burnout phase for some of them, maybe for the label as a whole, but I don't think that's going far enough. It's more of a transitional phase, out of what made this label iconic, and onto what makes this label more money, even if it means abandoning the community behind them. The embodiment of Matthew 16:26, for what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? And don't even get me started on the second half of the year, because even with Monstercat's rhythm influx being at its worst, there was still a lot of songs that at least try to make up for it. For NCS though, not only did the lows find a way to get worse, but the scarce highlights we had before inexcusably ran out. What I saw was a label that was scrambling for new ideas when they already had something that worked. You want to know how bad this list is? Only 3 songs from my top 10 worst last year would contend anywhere on this list, let alone the list proper. In fact, Riot 10's Threats probably wouldn't even make my top 3 here. All this to say, this is easily the worst year I have reviewed, and quite possibly the worst year I have witnessed on the label. I genuinely don't want to keep reviewing this label if nothing changes, and sadly I don't know if anything will. For those who haven't seen my ranking videos before, the top 10 will consist of 1 track per artist to make things fair, and it will be originals only, which means songs like Mortals Funk, Fearless Funk, and Cradles Funk will not be on this list. So with that, let's talk about some dishonorable mentions. Shadow Glow by Janji. The AI controversy, I think with the vocals, is one thing, but the production elsewhere, even down to the concept, is really unpolished. A far cry from what he used to make. Rush by Nomu. A brand of hyperpop / trap rap that's just downright needless. A poorly mixed and distorted 82 seconds of a song that only feels like a throwaway in the end. Montajum Toma by MXZI, Sketcha1, and X972. While so many funk tracks didn't even feel like they were worth discussing, this was probably the most popular original from that influx. With a lot of these songs, the production is often over-distorted, but the bigger issue here is that it doesn't give me anything worth revisiting. Hold It Up to the Light by Zelly. Zelly feels like the whipped cream of the NCS label, a mostly house and techno-oriented producer and vocalist whose music has almost always been a mixed bag. This one almost made my list proper, mostly because of how awful the siren was in the first drop. Flowers in My Head by Diecold and Prod94. Again, what even was the point? The kick is non-existent in the drop, the rest of the production is baffling, and much like a lot of the digicore push, I have no clue how this even got here. Transfer by SUPXR. And speaking of digicore, at least Tempo found a way to grow on me, where the slow pacing actually kinda worked. But even that song doesn't invalidate the issues with the double single as a whole. Feels pointless for a trap rap song like this to get such a push, and apparently as an exclusive as well. Warrior by Maestro Chives, Marin Hoxa, and Chris Linton. One of the biggest examples of mainstays desperately reaching for old tricks. Having violins as the lead sound of a drop often doesn't work, especially when there isn't much else to offer. And the psytrance structure is also fairly basic and lethargic. Want Your Body by Taylor Torrance and Kyra Masto. I guess Monstercat isn't the only genre that struggled with hard dance this year. The second drop is pretty underwhelming, and some of the vocal chops throughout are very annoying. High Grade by Fusion and Niche. I was about to look past this song. With the drops here, all it really has are some low-end bass fades and a lot of vocal hums that just don't work at all. And the last dishonorable mention, You Caught by Gasper, Broistar, and Waddles. Yes, I did in fact catch. Cut it right at the tail end of the year, and it's a total mess in terms of production, percussion, and auto-tune. With a lot of these songs, again, it's just a case of what was the point. And with all of that out of the way, it is finally time to talk about the top 10 worst NCS songs of 2025. Number 10. More than anything, I want this list to bring home the point that as bad as the funk influx has been by itself, there's a bigger elephant in the room. One that may be led by this genre, but not limited to it. So if you think there's a particular funk song I missed, that's probably the reason why. But as for this song, you could call it recency bias, but this is one of many examples where the vocals really let it down. Or maybe it isn't the vocal itself, actually. When the influx is shoved down your throat enough, you can tend to understand the formula or template behind its production, which was mowed down the label so many times to the point where a lot of it felt similar. Now, there are three particular things wrong with this. First off, the vocal. The way it bleeds out, especially in the drop, is pretty terrible. Secondly, the production with the plucks in particular is very cheap, and the mixing does it no favors by making it overshadow everything else. The bass line doesn't feel like it's there, and as I said before, the template. The way it's structured makes it feel slapdash overall. And lastly, just like a lot of other funk songs, only 73 seconds? That just adds on to its pointless disposability. Talk about Livin' La Vida Loca. This song is Livin' La Mala Vida. Number 9. Alright, so this one fell back on me. Doesn't mean it's still not a total mess, though. The track that really introduced this whole trend of digicore. And it's weird to think that, at least for me, this song wound up being a sign of things to come, even more than Mortal's Funk was. With all the things that happened afterward, this fell out of place at the time, and even though it's lower on my list than it used to be, it also made me more infuriated at what it felt like it started. The way it opens here, it's innocent enough with the pulse lead, the bass, and the sharp string chords that are just all too simple. And it only gets worse as it progresses. Once the drop hits, it just adds a basic drum pattern along with some odd water droplets and some background vocal chops that are even worse. It's hard to give credit to the main melody when pretty much every other element around it is just distracting. And that's about all it has as well. The drops, especially in the background elements, are insanely repetitive, and it gives me nothing worth revisiting. And while we're on the topic of trends outside of Brazilian funk that plagued NCS this year, number 8. There were so many circles and genres that had to step down this year. I mean, what circles even did well with what they had? The Yellow Circle felt like it was infected with funk and forgettable garage over the course of the year. The Witch House trend was tolerable, but mostly just existed as if this label ran out of ideas. The Orange Electropop-based circle, apart from Netrum, has never been anything special. The Red Circle, well, did have Bizarre this year, he was pretty good. The Pink Circle felt the most like typical NCS and still didn't have a lot to offer. But what happened with the Green Circle this year? You know, Whipped Cream already proved in 2024 that trap rap usually doesn't work well for a big EDM-based label. especially when the autotune can overshadow any sense of talent for the sake of vibes. The vocal here with a bloated autotune in mind is unnecessarily robotic, and the filtering of it only makes it emptier. And speaking of empty, the rest of the production. I don't think comparing this to Who's Laughing Now is fair, but I think it could point out some issues with the trap rap scene in relation to these labels. At least the production there tries to have a sort of muscle, despite feeling like a template. Here though, okay, the ambience itself is not bad, but the issue is that there isn't much else. Might be to provide more space for the already flimsy vocals, but that only adds on to what makes this so flat. I'm not going to get too mad at the artists themselves for a lot of these. This is more on the label. The theme I had back in 2023 rings 10 times louder this year. I think I've said enough now. Number 7. Remember when I just said I wasn't going to get too mad at the artists in particular? I mean, a lot of this list is new arrivals, with most of them being one-offs. But the next two are about proven talents that had a complete swing and a miss this year. One of the artists here I'm starting to feel bad for picking on 3 years in a row, especially given how he moved to a different genre last year and still found ways to annoy me, maybe even more so this time around. Now some, if not most songs on the list represent trends that usually don't work for me, and here, I'm just sick and tired of this sort of stuff. Guess it was time for round 2, huh? At least Party Pioneers last year tried to feel like a party, but from the title alone, there's a sort of baffling and sarcastic irony that comes with this. A lot of it with an uncredited artist who really let the song down, just like Party Pioneers, Helene. Now, Step Into the Light with Sound Rush was an example of how she can showcase her talents. And often it has to be connected with confident or at least competent lyricism, and on the NCS label, that often hasn't been the case. The hook in particular is where that lyricism feels the most sarcastic and cheesy, and the tone of the production down to its chord progression is pretty sour as well. By the time Rouge and Noise try to showcase their production outside of Helene's vocals, it's too late. And even then, it doesn't tell me anything new. Maybe apart from the retro section and the break that's interesting, but just kinda there. Also, with this kind of techno, I may have talked about it last year, but it's a brand that mainstream artists have used before that often feels like it's only for the sake of commercial value rather than anything genuinely captivating. And that's probably the main reason why it's not easy to like. Best I leave this one alone. Number 6. How is this song not even in my top 5? It's arguably the biggest example of mainstays absolutely screwing themselves over. It's even more telling that this was the one artist who got himself a noticeable long play. And while there were scarce highlights within, overall, Cartoon had a bad year, and this might be his absolute worst song on the label. I'm starting to think NCS is not a good label for albums. Even last year, it was Yanvidz with Misunderstood and Quarks and Shia Mansell with Broken String. And somehow, Cartoon and Friends feels more interesting to talk about, even if it's not good. Around Us and Dependent were decent songs, but the rest of the album ranged from mediocre to atrocious. Often the worst stuff comes from baffling or run-of-the-mill drops or overall concepts, but in this case, it's with one of the worst vocals I have heard all year. No disrespect to Emily J, the concept in and of itself is difficult to pull off for me, and she does not fit with that concept at all. I cannot stand how absolutely nonchalant and cringeworthy all of it is. And it's only made worse by the flimsy production, where the drop is basic within the stabs and one-note mallets. It lacks any sort of gusto or intrigue, and instead wants to push those awful vocals. It's one of those songs where nobody feels like they even want to be here. And let me emphasize, if I haven't already, this is only number 6 on this list. Number 5. The final 5. There really could have been more songs to put on my list that represent how the worst of the year was not only unlistenable, but also unnecessary for the label. In fact, we start with a song that was once my number 1 for that reason. With the rest of the list, a lot of it I can imagine is swept under the radar by other rankers. Maybe it's a case of being too easy to ignore to really consider. But this was one of the clearest examples of an undercooked and undeserving song representing a bigger trend. In this case, around the digicore scene. And I emphasize the term undercooked here. It's one of the simplest NCS songs I've heard to date, and not in a good way. To start, something personal about me, I don't like Friday Night Funkin'. The music there, especially in and around the main character, is centered around pretty awful vocal chops, and that's about all the vocal chops in this song remind me of. And what else even is there? A filtered kick and some claps to represent a Jersey Club percussion, some stabs in the corner to stand as one of the only parts of the ambience. It's another song that's less than 90 seconds and sounds unfinished more than anything. And this is one of multiple songs that left me wondering how this one even got here. And that is one of the worst things you could possibly do. Number 4. So this year, to further push the funk trend, NCS collaborated with Internet Sounds, which felt like one of many sellout moments for the sake of commercial value. With a lot of these songs being disposable or not worth revisiting, there were 2 particular songs that stood out in the worst way. And you know, there's a part of me that wants to give credit to this. Maybe it was trying to go for a nightmarish feel, but I don't think that was intended. Wanna know why? Just look at the title. Cryjax was an artist that I had to look up to make sure that he wasn't a one-off. Mercury, though, I knew wasn't a one-off heading into this song. Iuda and Epic Funk were some of the, I guess, relatively brighter spots of the influx, at least in the eyes of other rankers, so, what a way to blow it all up. With a song title like that, I was expecting some anime-based vocals, but that is far from the main issue. Because the drops here, oh boy, they are some of the most over-distorted I have ever heard within the influx. The kick is really more bass-oriented and less transient compared to other songs. Maybe it was trying to go for something Moombahton-related, but doesn't work too well at that. And while most leads in funk are often plucky or undercut for other elements, like let's say a vocal sample, the distortion here makes them excessively screechy. It's almost fascinating how creepy this song is. Maybe a concept like this would have worked in another genre, but while it at least hops out of the usual template, it finds a new way to be a disaster. Number 3. This was another one that fell out of my top spot. In this case, last minute. It's been a tough top 5 to reorder, but I figured this top 3 makes the most sense in terms of songs that had nothing to offer and nothing to convince me that it deserved a spot anywhere near this label. As harsh as it sounds, you have to hear them out for yourself, and I think you'll realize that with songs like these being accepted, it's emblematic of how this year was a shell of what this label once was. And like Mercury, QK Rain was a new arrival that had another song heading into this one. Missing Life with Gabriel was more of a slow-paced brand of Jersey Club that at least felt tolerable in the production. And speaking thereof, quick shout out to Gabriel, by the way. He may have been the main drive in that production, given his following EP, which had moments of promise but felt underdeveloped compared to EPs outside the label. And it was still one of the better parts of the second half of that year. QK Rain, on the other hand, what even happened here? This song has one of the messiest productions I've heard, and it's trying to reference the club boom on top of that. The instrumental sounds extremely cheap and undercooked and also insanely repetitive, and the vocal production, if you can look past the auto-tune, you'll realize how it's overly airy near the highs and lacks any sense of body. Ironically, the desperate falsetto section makes it even worse, as does the lyricism on occasion. It's not even one that I would say fits with a particular influx or really fits for anything. Maybe someone might throw this on you, but I'd rather throw this away. Number 2. With all the lowlights in the funk influx to pick out, I think this might be a pick out of left field. As someone who's been producing music for about 3.5 years now, it's easier for me to understand and maybe nitpick the mixing of other songs. But the mixing has to be downright atrocious to warrant a spot this high on its own. Really, the only other song from the label I can say this about is Koza's Paradox. Guess this song is joining a very exclusive tier. The story behind it is a tale of two perspectives. If I'm not mistaken, some of the Internet Sounds collaborations were made by members of the NCS staff, some of them likely more experienced in production than others. Now, on one hand, I do have sympathy for those who may not have worked with producing music themselves all too often before, but on the other hand, if there's one glaring example of many where the management unnecessarily and desperately looked for new and flailing ideas, this concept as a whole is probably the most infuriating one out there, more than this particular song itself. By the way, do you notice how I haven't talked about the lyricism of a single funk song yet? Most of it I already mentioned in years prior and haven't even delved into here because the production and template at this point are already bad enough on their own. Now with the song itself, the first drop doesn't tell me anything new, but it then goes for a build-up, tries to generate some tension approaching the second drop, perhaps with something house-oriented based on the lead sound, but it just falls apart. The concept feels like it does the bare minimum with the instrumentation, and the execution couldn't even do the same. The funk kick simply buries everything else in the mix, and it ultimately destroys the overall production. Again, no vitriol or anything with the artists in particular. There's a bigger issue that overshadows poor talent or production. It's an underlying question of what even is the point of so many songs like this being released on the label. Number 1. Not every lowlight has to be downright unlistenable. Some songs can be the worst by being the absence of anything good or even interesting. This was another one that may have been swept under the radar for some people, but again, at some point, you have to wonder how these sort of songs even wind up making it here in the first place. So I'll ask once more, what happened with the Green Circle this year? Back in 2023, I pointed more fingers at the NCS label itself rather than most of the artists in question. The theme of that worst list was, why did NCS even accept this? And even with most of the artists here, especially the hundreds of one-offs, it feels like, I don't know and often don't really care for their artistry outside of the label. But with most of this top 5, it didn't represent just bad or needless productions, it represented damaging trends. Most of which meant to cater to the rise of short-form content, which is probably all that it makes sense for. All of that before I move on to the song itself. It's just a simple trap template that repeats with no storyline or tension, before restarting and playing a much slower version of the exact same production. Now, any song that desperately references, or in this case flat out steals memes without doing much else, should not be classified as competent. And the rest of the production is completely stagnant. The fact that this sort of stuff is being accepted just for the sake of short-form content, I mean, I don't know if I could possibly think of another reason as to how this made it here. And I can say that about all the songs in my top 5, and probably multiple others that I haven't even mentioned. But while it was tough to decide, this one was just the most pointless package of nothingness out there. That is what makes it the worst NCS song of 2025. And that'll wrap up this video. Well, angry enough for you? Anything I missed? Let me know of your least favorites in the comments below. And if you guys enjoyed, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And I'll talk to you in the next video.